Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So today we're looking at a really important sword, not just in Chinese history, but actually in world history, certainly relating to Europe and the Middle East as well. And that is the Heavenly Horse Cavalry Dao, specifically, from LK Chen. Link below, of course, to their website. Now, one of the reasons why this is so important as a sword, so it dates to this design, and this is modelled on originals, it dates to around the 1st century BC through to the 1st, 2nd century AD, so around the time of Christ in the Middle East, of course. And so this is a contemporary of the Roman period, basically, Republican Empire. But it is specifically a cavalry sword, and you will already see how long it is before I take it out of the scabbard, compared to the typical infantry Dao, which is the Royal Arsenal, which I've reviewed before. Check out that review on my channel if you haven't already. I've done some cutting with this as well, so that's worth looking at in reference to this longer one. But you can see that this is kind of like an oversized, larger one. Now I'm going to dispense with the scabbard just quickly, and you will now see, hopefully, how humongous this thing is. So there's the infantry version and there's the cavalry version. And this was extremely long, and especially when we consider the general proportions of the blade as well. It's a relatively narrow blade. Very comparable with later 19th century sabres, as it happens, and I'll talk about a little bit of a comparison with those in a bit. But for the period, these are very technologically sort of accomplished blades. To make a steel blade of these proportions, of this length, in very large numbers and stored in arsenals to be used by huge numbers of cavalrymen, is very impressive achievement, firstly. But secondly, just the design of the thing. Now, not to say that the Chinese were the only people making long cavalry blades in this general era. They weren't, you know, the Sassanids and various other people also did. But what's interesting about these is they seem, not 100%, but they seem, there is a large amount of supporting evidence to suggest that these swords were developed in response to external threat. Now, specifically the external threat, and I'm going to butcher this word, I'm sure, but I've looked on the internet for how to pronounce it, and noticed that lots of the pronunciations are wrong. But the Hyunsu, which I will now call Hungsu, okay, because that's easy for me to say. So who were these Hungnu? Well, the fact is that there's many different theories, and this is a widely debated topic. It's not really for me to go into great depth in this video, but it's a really interesting one if you want to read about it. Even if you just look at the Wikipedia page, there's quite interesting information there, and then you can branch out from there, look at their sources, and see lots of other interesting articles that have been written on it. It seems to be that they were either a confederation of different peoples, and there seems to be some supporting evidence for this being the case, or they were what were later known as the Huns, or they were sort of proto-Mongols or proto-Turkic people. Some people even argue that they were Iranian, Persian, or a combination of these, as I say, a confederation. It seems to me linguistically that there's good support for it possibly being the Huns and what later became known as the Huns. And I've done a video about the Huns, who were the Huns, and some people, amazingly, I didn't know when I made that video, it's quite a contentious topic, especially in Hungary, because it relates to people's sense of their own ethnicity, which I hadn't really considered. But when we're talking about ancient periods, 2,000 years ago, in this case, you have to be a little bit careful about making a direct correlation between a group of people who existed 2,000 years ago and a group of people who exist now, because we've had 2,000 years of migration, interaction, conquest, ethnic cleansing, everything you can think of. So the fact is, who were these people that the Chinese were fighting against? We don't really know, but I suspect that they had some strong connection to the later Huns, who of course invaded the Roman Empire. The important part to note is that they used large amounts of cavalry, and therefore the Chinese had to use large amounts of cavalry to oppose them, or to neutralize the cavalry threat and their mobility, and they had to develop a special sword for that purpose. At least this is one theory. It's not the only theory, and it's not necessarily 100% correct. So don't shoot the messenger. I'm conveying to you what I have learned about these swords since I've been reading about them, and you may have read other theories. But whether these were inspired by foreign swords, or emulating foreign swords, or if they were developed purely in China as a response to the weapons and equipment and fighting style of the external enemy, I don't know, and I don't know if anyone knows that. I'm sure there are lots of differing ideas and theories for that. And why do I say that this sword is so important to the development of world swords, not just Chinese? And that's because ultimately this type of Dao, probably particularly the longer types, influenced a lot of other sword developments in different places, whether we're looking at Japan, whether we're looking at what became Mongolia, we're looking at Han weapons, possibly even Turkic weapons, and the spread out of these types of swords influenced, and I won't say directly led to, but certainly heavily influenced the development of lots of other types of swords, even all the way up to the 19th century. And in some ways we could potentially trace back European 19th century military sabres to these swords of 2,000 years earlier. But it is quite clear that this sword is a larger version of the shorter infantry Dao, and it does seem that this is at least should we say, a native Chinese design. It may have had some influence externally, but by and large it's a Chinese sword. And it seems that when they decided to arm the cavalry, they just went, well, let's make a giant one. Now, how big is this? Well, just to put this into context, as I like to do on this channel, I've got a tape measure here. You can of course find all the stats and the weight and everything else on the Chen website, linked below. But this is nearly, well, in effect, it's a 37-inch blade. That's 94 centimeters for the metric of you out there. Now, 37 inches or 94 centimeters, not only is that an extremely long blade for the period, but it's a generally quite long blade for sabres in general, of any period. Not necessarily always for thrusting swords, and when we get into things like estocks and palashes and stuff like that, funnily enough, that length, 37 inches, 94 centimeters, is pretty much standard for quite a few 18th and 19th century cuirassier and swords and palashes and things like this. But if we just pull the ubiquitous French 1822 light cavalry sword, this has an extremely, although of course it's curved, but it has an extremely similarly proportioned blade in terms of the width and length. In fact, the French sword, 19th century sword, is broader, and it's a little bit thicker. Okay, but generally speaking, overall, it's in the same ballpark of size, which I think's interesting because, of course, it's for performing a similar task. It's a cut and thrust blade. I think this is predominantly a cutting blade rather than a thrusting blade because of the asymmetrical point and the fact that there's not an awful lot to stop your hand, keep your hand on the hilt when delivering thrusts, especially on horseback. I did talk about this issue in reference to the infantry sword and how that troubles me slightly when trying to interpret how this was used with the shield, because generally speaking, with a large shield and a short sword, you use it a lot for thrusting. And I'm not so sure that the hand is very secure on this. Some people did talk about use of the ring and putting the little finger through the ring. I'm not so convinced by that myself. Other people talked about using a sword knot, which is possible, and there is evidence for that. Sword knots are shown to put through the ring here, but again, I'm not so sure how well that would stop your hand from running up. But with a cavalry sword, you're moving a horse at speed, and if you're delivering point, giving a thrust, then there's a lot of force going into that sword, and I think it's super risky in terms of keeping your hand on the grip. Now, just while I'm talking about horses, I should of course mention that whilst I can test and demonstrate a lot of these swords, and to some degree the way that they would have been used, my ability to do that with this sword is somewhat limited by the fact that I don't have a horse to hand. Obviously there are other YouTubers out there who do, Jason Kingsley looking at you, but this is a cavalry sword, and so to some extent I don't want anything I do or demonstrate with this sword to necessarily be taken as how these swords were predominantly used, because of course they were predominantly designed to be used on horseback. Now on that topic, how does this handle? Well, I have mentioned before that these Chinese dao are actually quite stick-like, because if you look at them, there is nothing in terms of the guard or the pommel that really adds much mass at the holding end of the sword, okay, at the hilt end of the sword. And the pommels are really a hand stop. They don't have any mass to them. And you don't have any handle sticking out of the back like a katana or wakizashi or a da with length at the back to give balance. So really, holding one of these swords in terms of how it handles in the hand is really very, very similar to just picking up a stick and holding a stick at the end. They handle exactly like a stick. I mean, even the tang in these is full width, so it's not like the tang even has any reduced mass there. It's literally just holding a bar, a lever. In this case it's sharpened steel, in this case it's wood, but they actually handle in very, very similar ways, holding a stick at the end to holding the cavalry dart at the end. Now, in terms of these as cutting weapons, I've spoken quite a bit about how swords were used on horseback. I'm not a horseman, but I do study period sources, some of which are descriptive and describe, you know, actual actions by people who were fighting on horseback in the 19th century or earlier. And I also study the treatises or manuals instructing people how to use their swords on horseback. And it should be noted, particularly in 19th century context, which is what I often talk about on this channel, that cavalrymen often couldn't ride before they got to their regiment, surprisingly to some people. They were actually taught to use their swords on foot, and they were taught to ride separately, I think probably for the safety of the horses, and then those two things were put together later on when they were a little bit more competent. So they would learn to do all the stuff on foot with the sword, and they literally used to sit there sometimes on a wooden horse, but sometimes just pretending, like me right now, pretending to sit on a horse holding the reins, and they would actually just go through the guards and the cuts and the parries and everything else. Which is, of course, what you teach an absolute beginner. You teach them the basics of what to do with their weapon and what they're to do with their horse at the same point that they're doing that thing with their weapon. Now, in terms of how this might be used, therefore, really, in my mind, not dissimilar to a later 19th century cavalry sabre. It is not as well balanced as most, or I don't like this term well balanced, but it is common parlance. What do I mean by that? What I mean is there is very little bringing the point of balance back towards the hand, okay? So the point of balance, just to demonstrate, is quite far, really far from the hand. That's close to, I mean, just visually, that's about 11 inches, I would say, from the hand. It's a little bit under 1 foot, so we're talking about 30 centimetres or a little bit under. So that is really quite far point of balance from the hand, which for a cavalry sword is absolutely fine. For fighting on foot, it does mean that it's a relatively light sword, so I can still move it around relatively deftly, but the point of balance is quite far out, and particularly with this short grip, without an awful lot to really keep my hand there, certainly if I was giving thrust, giving a point, as I've explained. But even in cutting, I've really got to rely on that pommel at the end to stop my hand slipping off. It's a little bit of an unwieldy sword, even though it's light and even though it's got good distal taper. Starts off about 8mm thick and tapers down this way. So although we've got no profile taper, we've definitely got good distal taper. So it doesn't handle exactly like a stick because of that distal taper, but it does have a bit of that quality to it. And it's not very easy to recover when you move the thing through the air. And you know, I use swords on a regular basis in class and sparring and stuff. Now that sparring's opened again, we'll talk about that in another video. But it's not that easy to control. So as I mentioned, I have talked about the use of sword on horseback in the past, and if people play video games and stuff, if you play Bannerlord or you know, Chivalry or whatever else, Kingdom Come Deliverance, then often in video games it's demonstrated people really swinging swords from horseback. But of course the problem is you've got a horse there. You've got a horse between your legs and you've got a horse's neck and head in front of you. So you've got to be a little bit cautious about swinging anything where you might hit your own horse, because do you know what? Not only is your horse valuable and your friend, but your horse is also the one thing that can get you out of there if everything goes wrong and you need to get away and live to fight another day. So you don't want to deliberately or even accidentally, you know, run any risk of injuring your horse, because your horse is your lifeline. Remember Richard III, a horse, my kingdom for a horse. So look at, you know, that's a whole nother video talking about Richard III, but let's remember that you don't want to run any risk of hitting your horse. So giving cuts on horseback is often about actually laying the blade out and across the thing you're hitting rather than swooshing at it. Okay, on foot you can swoosh all you like as long as there's no one standing close to you who you don't want to injure, but on horse it's a different situation. It is a replica of actual swords that were used in war by the Chinese against the Hungnu Confederation, and you know, so it is what it is. It is a replica of a cavalry sword of that time. And my suspicion is that they used this riding at high speed, laying the blade onto the target, or, you know, hitting the thing without a big swoosh. And these weren't used on foot very much for fighting on foot. You go to the shorter, more easily maneuverable and handleable and usable with a shield, shorter version. The long ones are fascinating weapons, but they don't make very good foot combat swords in my opinion. So finally, let's actually look at the sword, and I will do a relatively brief review from my point of view of what I think of it. So full disclosure, okay, I've actually had two of these swords. One of them is off camera, but I still have it here, and the first one had a manufacturing flaw which I pointed out, and LK Chen, fantastic customer service as always, okay, and yes, I get sent these as free samples, but I know plenty of people who buy swords from them and have had equally good customer service from them, okay. And so the first one had a flaw, and that flaw was a slight twist in the blade, and I said to LK Chen, I said, look, I can review this, but it probably won't perform very well, and I will be obliged to mention this twist in the blade, and I'm mentioning this to you now, because when you've got a twist or warp in the blade, it's not going to cut so well. And full disclosure, I have other swords that in my collection, in fact, who have warps in the blades, and I'm sure historically some swords had warp in the blade and were just used anyway. But anyway, they replaced it with this one, and this one is absolutely arrow straight. It's completely straight along the edge and has no flaws whatsoever in terms of the sort of manufacturing. Right, few quick things. I'll come to the scabbard last, I think. So the blade has the same complex characteristic, we look along it this way, as the Royal Arsenal dowel does. So it is not straight. When I hold it up on camera to you here, it might look like a really simple straight blade, but it's actually not. It has a bit of a yataghan curve. That is, the edge actually goes forward and then recurves a bit. So the tip is in line with the center of the grip, which is very, very interesting. Now, I mentioned that asymmetrical tip and it not being very well suited to thrusting. This is a general rule, and it's one of the criticisms for the French 1822 sabre, incidentally, is that generally a spear tip, that is a tip which is in the center alignment of the blade, is more conducive for thrusting without the blade being deflected or diverted either at the tip end or at the back end. However, what you can do with this asymmetrical type of tip, and then what they've done here, is put it in line with the center of the blade via this recurve, okay, and you'll find that with certain other types of sword as well. For example, yataghans can be like that. Okay, so an interesting cross-section. The blade is beautifully made. It has no flaws that I am aware of. Obviously, I haven't destructively tested it yet, but it's pretty sharp. Okay, so as I've noted in previous videos, LK Chen edges have very good edge geometry, but they're not always quite finished in terms of the polish of the edge, in my opinion. That being said, compared to other manufacturers who provide sharp swords, even compared to a high-end manufacturer like Albion, for example, they're on a par with those. And I have to say there are very, very few, almost no, manufacturers of swords who produce, or sell rather, deliver an edge that I would regard as competition cutting sharp, should we call it. Okay, pretty much all sharp swords that are sold, and we just have to accept this, are almost there. And what the best we can hope for really is very good edge geometry and an adequate edge, okay, for water bottle cutting, kind of adequate water bottle cutting. This edge, I can softly run my fingers along the blade without cutting them, okay, so it doesn't have that bite to it, but it is a fine edge, and I would not want to push my hand hard against it and do that. One thing about the LK Chen edges I found is that you'll find like a super sharp bit, and then it'll be a bit less sharp, then a super sharp bit, then a bit less sharp. So they're a little bit inconsistent in their final polish along the edge as you go along. But the edge geometry, as I say, is a single bevel, very, very good, okay? Very good edge geometry. So if you want to make these into super cutters, you can do quite easily with just some edge polishing. The pattern in the steel, I don't know if you'll be able to see this as always on camera, but let's give it a go. Ah, yes, you can. So you can see it is a pattern welded blade, very, very attractive, as all of the, pretty much, not all actually, but a lot of the LK Chen swords are. That is not historically accurate for 2,000 years ago. They would have used a sort of layered or laminated construction, but you would have, at least if you acid etched it, you would have had a visible structure to the steel. So it wouldn't look like a modern mono steel, because it wasn't a modern mono steel. It would have been a complex structured steel. Whether it had a deliberate pattern to it or not, I don't know. I suspect not. And whether they etched them or not, I don't know. But you can do a light etch, even with lemon juice, for example, and it will show up. But anyway, you've got a very attractive pattern weld in this. Good edge geometry, beautiful blade, straight looking along it. It has a nice flex, you will notice, because of the distal taper. So the flex is in the second half of the blade. This half of the blade stays stiff, because it's thicker. So it starts off about 8 millimeters, I guess, and goes down to about 4 millimeters. So therefore, when you flex it, as most decent swords should, it flexes in the second half of the blade, not in the first half of the blade. This gives it nice stability in the hand when you're moving it around, also gives you good stability in the bind against another sword or hitting armor or shields or anything else hard, and gives you good stability in the cut and tracking through the cut correctly as well. In terms of the hilt construction, it's the standard military mass-produced dowel hilt, which is historically accurate. In this case, it's red silk cord instead of black silk cord. I personally don't really like the red silk cord, but I understand that it might be completely authentic. I think it would look nicer if it was a darker hue. It just looks a little bit too bright to me, and to me the sort of clash between the brass bolster here, which we'll talk about in a second, and the red wrap is just, it kind of makes the product look cheaper than it actually is. It's a well-produced, classy product, so to me it should have a slightly richer colour to the grip. But we have to concede that these historically were mass-produced items kept in arsenals, so what colour these were originally, who knows? They could have been white, they could have been black, they could have been brown, I don't know. But I just think that it's a bit of an orangey red, and I'm not a huge fan of it. It has these ribs on it, and these ribs are essential. Now, whether there's any evidence for those historically, I don't know, but I suspect that LK Chen put them on because, as I said, this is quite an unwieldy sword on foot. It's quite tip heavy, although it's a light sword. In terms of its mass, a lot of its mass is quite far up the blade because it's a cavalry sword. So you really need that to provide a good grip. And I have pointed out in my previous video that I found the grip of the silk cord of the shorter dowel, the infantry dowel, it's adequate because this is a very light and wieldable sword and short. So it's fine to keep a grip on this sword. But if this was a weightier blade, if it was a longer, heavier blade, it's quite difficult to keep your grip on there. So these ribs on here I think are really, really important, and theoretically they could help with delivering a thrust and stopping your hand riding up, but I don't personally think that that's quite enough. The cord wrap has been well done, nothing to really criticise there. The ring is welded onto the tang, which is almost a full width tang. You can just see the wood sticking up, which might be ebony wood, but I'm not sure. There are slats that are either side of the tang just to broaden up that tang and give a more rectangular grip. I know that some people will probably find this grip too small, okay? And if we look at my hand when I grip it, my fingers aren't stopping there as they normally would do, but they're going inside my own hand if I grip it in a real ham-fistedly or rather. And that is quite small for me, and I like small grips. And I know that most people I train with and most people, other people who review swords, prefer fatter grips than I do. I really don't like overly fat grips. I'd rather have a grip that was too small than a grip that was too large, because I feel you can still keep a secure grip on a grip that's too small, and I can't keep a secure grip on a grip that's too big. But anyway, so for me, it's a little bit too small. I suspect that for lots of other people, it will be quite a bit too small, and so I think that that probably needs bulking up somehow. Unfortunately, I would say that that would reduce the aesthetic appeal of the sword, because if you've got a fat grip, it would make the blade look very narrow, so that's problematic. Finally, the bolster. So the bolster is simple brass, and I'm sure it's perfectly, let's try and get the focus, I'm sure it's perfectly historically accurate. You can see the wood of the grip inside there, which fits okay. It's, you know, utilitarian, basic, and the ferrule is quite simple and it's brass. To me, it looks a little bit cheap, and I can't really explain why. I don't know whether it's because it's just a flat piece of brass bent around and brazed, or whether it's the colour of the brass. I don't know. I'm just not really a fan, and I did mention a similar thing anyway with the guard section on the infantry dowel. But as it happens, I prefer this. I mean, this is a proper guard almost on the infantry dowel, whereas on the cavalry one, which kind of needs it more, I don't understand why they would have less there, because if you ever want to thrust on horseback, you need more of a guard to stop the hand rather than less of a guard. But anyway, so I'm not really a big fan of that bolster. I think it would look better if it was cast, I think. But again, this is based on an original sword, so I'm kind of reluctant to criticise it, because if that's what the original archaeological found examples have, then who am I to criticise? Because it's a replica of a historical sword. Finally, the scabbard. So the scabbard's perfectly nice, made of wood, believe it's ebony, it's nice and stiff, well made, sort of box section. The fittings are, the only thing I would say is a similar criticism, or should we say opinion, and this is only my opinion. The brass is very bright and looks very kind of modern. Now, there's nothing to say that that's not what the originals looked like when they were new. Maybe they did. But they're a little bit sharp-edged, a little bit boxy, and a little bit bright. I think they'd look nicer in bronze than in brass personally, or if they were just darkened somehow. They're just a bit bright and gaudy, and I think especially when you've got the red wrap contrasting. But in terms of the quality, it all seems fine. Now, that's the wrong sword. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to step outside and just have a little bit of a movement with the sword, maybe cut a couple of things and report back with final feedback. So something I find with these is, because the grip's so short and you've only got that ring there and the point of balance is so far up, it's a bit of work to keep hold of the sword actually, especially if you swing it hard. So it's something to be mindful of these, and in compensating, I find that I'm naturally trying to put my hand further up to give a little bit of safety margin behind the hand in case it slips down, but of course there is nowhere to move up. But anyway, these are a replica of this type of cavalry sword used at this time. So maybe the grip needs to be rethought, and maybe the grip needs to be wrapped in such a way that keeps your hand more secure even than just having these little ribs. Personally, I find it a little bit of a handful. Certainly the harder I swing, the harder it is to keep hold of it. Although, as I mentioned, with this type of cavalry use, it's possible that they simply weren't swung like this. It's possible that they were just simply held out across the target as they rode past. Who knows? Let's do a little bit of bottle cutting. One thing I will say so far, it does seem like you have quite naturally good edge alignment with these because of the rectangular grips, although as mentioned the grip's a little bit on the small side for my hand. So it looks like a clean cut, but not a very straight cut. I guess maybe I scooped it. So let's try a straighter line this time. Yeah, so I mean that was just that was just a better cut by me. It was much straighter, very clean through. The first cut was a bodged cut. Let's have a go on a milk bottle. So yeah, quite pleased with that. 6 cuts out of a milk bottle. Clean, no effort. I wasn't powering through. I was trying to do a consistent line with 70%, 60-70% force. You can actually see, maybe you can't with the sunlight here, but all of the water on the blade is up here. So I'm cutting with that final kind of 10 inches of blade from about the 26 inch to 37 inch region, which is interesting because having the centre of balance, the centre of gravity further away from the hand does add force to those blows with the tip cuts, and having this style tip like you would find on certain other types of sabre or falchion or katana even does give you a better cutting tip than if you would have a spear tip on there, for example. So this is able to give tip cuts, basically, cuts from very long range, which is certainly advantageous if you're sitting on a horse. I'm just going to try a couple of cuts on some dried freestanding wood. That's pretty clean right there. You'll see it did break a little bit on the back. This is dried wood though, it's not green wood. Very clean through there. Let's have another go. So this is the thicker end. It went about 50% of the way through. No, I don't think there's no twisting or bending or anything like that to the blade. Let's have another go. So went deeper that time about, I'll break it so you can see, hold on. Yeah, I guess it was maybe 50% again, maybe a little bit more. Certainly clean for as far as it went. This is dried wood and this is quite hard. I think this is oak actually. Let's have another try on a middle section. So that was rather interesting actually. It went most of the way through, then scooped and split split all along. So, but you can see it went through to about 60-70% of the depth through before it split the wood. Very, very clean. So one thing to note, there's no harm come to the blade, there's no issues, I can see where I've been cutting the wood is in this section, which is about right for what I'm used to. That's about the centre of percussion. There's no harm to the edge, no curling, no nicks or chips or anything like that. There's no bends, as I mentioned. One thing I do notice, so I am having to work hard to keep hold of this blade because the point of balance is so far up and it's such a long blade. I don't think that this type of blade is personally conducive to these. I mean, it gives a powerful strike, but the recovery is crap. I actually hit the ground slightly with my best cut there. I hit the ground slightly with the tip of this. It's a long blade designed to be used from horseback, and the point of balance is very far away from the hand, and that's a very small grip, and there's not an awful lot to grip onto. One other thing that I've noticed hitting the wood is that there's a fair amount of hand shock, and one of the reasons for that, of course, is because the grip is basically the tang. There's only a couple of thin slats of wood and then some wrapping around here, so it's a little bit hard on the hand when you hit a hard target, which you would do even if you were using these in period, if they were hitting things like well, potentially if you're hitting bone, but certainly if you're hitting things like armour or helmets or shields or other swords or lances, then you do get a fair amount of hand shock, and any shock you put into the blade here, you really feel it into the grip. But that's part and parcel of the design, and that's historically correct. Finally, I'm just going to hit those logs a few times because I'm interested in exploring that hand shock a little bit more, and I'm also looking to be a little bit more brutal to this sword and see if it suffers at all. Right, again, I'm not going full force. There's no bending to the blade. There's no curling or chipping or nicks or anything like that. I don't think maybe it's lost a little bit of the sharpness up here. Yeah, compared to up there, it's lost a little bit of sharpness possibly, but that's debatable. So no, it hasn't really suffered, it's all structurally sound. However, hand shock, ow! It's like holding just a bar of steel and hitting a log. You get a lot of hand shock from this. There's no dampening, there's no guard, there's no pommel, there isn't much wood around that tang. There's nothing really to absorb that hand shock apart from what's coming straight through the blade into your hand. And of all the swords I've ever used, this is some of the most hand shock I've ever experienced. But I want to reiterate that this type of sword was probably never ever used like this historically. This was probably used from horseback to hold the blade out while delivering the force with the speed of the horse, not for swinging, I think. So there we go. A fascinating sword, historical replica, 2,000-year-old cavalry sword design from LK Chen. And based on originals. I think we've learnt a lot about what this probably was and wasn't used for and how it was used in period. I've enjoyed using it a lot, and I'll certainly be using it again in future videos. I've also been asked by the people at LK Chen to do a cutting comparison between this and a 19th century sabre, and I can certainly do that. I don't have an awful lot of cutting materials here at the moment, so I'm going to be doing more cutting videos at a later date when I've got some more restocked with some stuff to cut. But very interesting sword, another one from LK Chen to check out. Check out the link below. Thanks for watching, give us a like and a subscribe, and I'll see you again soon. Cheers folks.